Haesteinn is by far the most overplayed character in all of Crusader Kings 3. To be fair to him, he's also by far one of the most interesting characters, so it makes sense. Many legends have already been written about the man by the time you play him, but then you can take him even further beyond all that. Here's the thing about legends though, they're pretty samey, which is anathema to Haesteinn, who has no two runs of the same outcome. What if I told you that there was a set of 5 new legends that even Haesteinn could explore off in the war-torn region of Persia? Well, I've got some good news for you, legend enjoyers. I've created a mod for CK3 which adds in 5 completely unique legends to the game, which are based on the Achaemenid Empire and some of its historical figures. This video is pretty much your average GIGACHAD story, but with the twist of also being a mod presentation to go along with the public release of the mod. If you caught some of my live streams, you could see me coding the mod live and even playtesting, so some of you might already know what's coming. But if you don't, and want to remain spoiler-free, keep in mind this video will only cover 1 of the 5 legends. There will still be 4 more for you to explore on your own. If you're interested in a much more in-depth legend system, then check the description below and take a look at the Achaemenid Legends mod releasing today. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy the video. Haesteinn was going about his normal life at the mouth of the Loire River when one day his good friend Bjorn Ironside informed him of reports for a returning Varangian that a land known as Persia had recently caught the attention of some Scandinavian explorers. It was said that beyond the impenetrable seas and mountains of Arabia and Armenia, there were regions where trade from as far east as the Dragon's Roost and as far west as the end of Hibernia meet. Esfahan, Bjorn called it, ruled by the Arab Dulafid family, was the center of this land, and Haesteinn had to get there if he wanted treasures beyond his imagination. The greedy Viking naturally set his eyes east, with the advice from his friend being his only guide. He would travel east until he met someone who knew of these Dulafids, which he suspected would be somewhere in Egypt or Syria. In this time raiding in the Mediterranean with Bjorn, he had encounters with Arabs, but never any Persians. With luck, the Arabs will be knowledgeable of this Esfahan. He first set out to Sardinia, which would be his new base of operations in the seas. Sardinia naturally fell to his Varangian veterans, and after politely asking the locals there about routes to Egypt, he set sail to the furthest eastern edge of Egypt, Sinai. While Sardinia had been a place quite familiar to Haesteinn, Sinai was a place he had heard of but never seen before. He first landed in Cairo to announce to the Sultan his intention to pass through into the Red Sea, but the Tulanid Sultan was quite familiar with what these Norse adventurers brought with them, so he said he'd have to fight his way in. Naturally, Haesteinn was already prepping his siege engines before even receiving an answer. "They're always so stubborn," he muttered. Cairo fell while the Egyptian armies cowered at the base of their holy mountain, while Haesteinn's troops moved on to Farama. These fortresses were quite vulnerable to his sappers, who could dig through the ground under the fortifications quite easily. Although he had only minimal actual siege equipment, sometimes all you need is a shovel, a little bit of engineering knowledge, and an inability to give up. Sinai was apparently the hiding place of the Egyptian army, but by the time Haesteinn got there, they'd already loaded up on boats and sailed back to Cairo. This game of cat and mouse was quite embarrassing for these supposedly powerful Arab conquerors of the time. The armies did finally meet in Sharqiya, where it became obvious why the Egyptians were running. They were soundly defeated, and with that, Haesteinn's control of Sinai was assured. During the battle, he captured some prisoners of war and demanded of them information on the Dulafid family and their holdings in Esfahan. They were a bit surprised by his interest in the region, as if it were some kind of mystical land, but in return for their lives, they were happy to explain some local history. You see, Haesteinn wasn't aware of the turmoil that currently was enveloping the region of Persia. Esfahan was once an immense city, which now was more of a middling city. It was right in the heart of Persia, and wasn't even a capital, but rather just another city ruled by the Dulafids, who made their home in the mountain fortress of Nihawand. The soldiers created maps to the best of their ability, suggesting a route through the Red Sea and around Oman into the Persian Gulf. Haesteinn had heard of the river they mentioned, the Tigris, which was a very important river that started from a lake in the east of Miklagard. With a new route planned, he set sail to Esfahan, hoping to find a beautiful city. Haesteinn's men were rugged and experienced troops who were of course natural seafarers, but the Zagros Mountains did prove difficult to scale. Thankfully, traders had found many routes, and Haesteinn had a natural touch with traders that let him get along quite well. Most of them were in awe of his foreign look, which indeed was not something most people in this region had ever seen. Arriving in Nihawand, it was obvious that this was some kind of capital given the size of the fortress, and although the dirt here was harder to dig through than in Egypt, Haesteinn's men quite easily made it through the walls. They heard, or rather extracted, reports of the Dulafid army in Esfahan, which of course made Haesteinn light up. This was it. The big city Bjorn told him of. The meeting place of eastern dragons and Hibernian snakes. He immediately went east and followed the trail of the army that had recently passed through. Upon arriving in Esfahan, the armies there had already left, but there it was, the big city. Esfahan was indeed quite a grand city, with a huge mosque of worship right in its center. This was, according to the locals, a mosque known as the Friday Mosque, which was an important day in their faith. Although he also heard conflicting reports that it was once a gathering place for fire worshippers. Strange. Either way, Haesteinn sieged the city but told his men to keep it intact. This would soon be their new mead hall, so any damage they do, we'll have to fix later anyway. The army occupied the city and turned back to confront the Dulifids outside Nihaland. Although the skilled Mubarazan of the Arab conquerors were competent and could certainly give quite a challenge to the Varangians, they didn't have the grit of the Norsemen. With the Dulifid army defeated and Hamadan occupied, the war was over, and Haesteinn moved his men back to Esfahan, where he began his rulership in his new home. He was a bit disappointed to see that Esfahan was not quite the bustling city he thought it would be, but it certainly was a new land that did not remind him of anywhere he'd ever been. With his new capital here, he immediately became a new piece on the chessboard of Persian politics. Who knew where this foreigner stood or what he would do, but for now, he sat in his castle, enjoying the fruits of his victories. From the city of Esfahan, Haesteinn had a central position from which to execute many raids across Arabia and Persia, which he did. He sent only his best men to raid, as he was actually hoping to provoke responses from his enemies, who might underestimate his smaller forces. Although some of the lesser vassals of Fars and Khuzestan were easily defeated, the Caliph in Baghdad did eventually come to confront Haestein's men, and they were defeated. At least he learned that this Arabian empire he had heard so much about was indeed a powerful entity to be feared. At first, there was a perception that Haestein's existence in Persia was a short-lived visit. Maybe he'd raid a little bit, take some treasures, and then go. The pest would exterminate itself in due time. But then Haesteinn began his conquest of Rai, and he began appointing lords to rule in his stead. Haesteinn was building up a kingdom in Persia, and this was definitely confirmed when he invaded Hamadan. The Dulifids, who were previously the frontier keepers of the region, had been displaced, and now a kingdom almost in the shape of the ancient Median Empire was forming around Esfahan rather than Ecbatana, or Hamadan as it's now known. All this talk of ancient cultures, of course, meant nothing to Haesteinn, who just wanted to extract as much wealth as he could from the region. These conquests are means to an acquisition of power for further raids for him, but already ideas and thoughts about what Haesteinn could be are being applied to him. While on a conquest to the east in Yazd, Haesteinn saw many ancient Zoroastrian sites, and although they meant nothing to him, they were quite something. He did take any valuables he could find, being a bit of a greedy penny pincher, but he noticed something strange. There were no more caravans coming, and the ones that did looked almost dead in a way. They had fear in their eyes and refused to talk. Haesteinn had seen stuff like this before. When the caravan routes are interrupted, there's either a war or a plague, and he hadn't heard of any wars, so there must be some plague out east. With luck, it won't spread further down the trade routes. Haestein's wife passed away while he was at war, and so he held a funeral for her, since, although the two had not fallen in love, she had birthed his children, and for that, she would be honored. It did feel kind of like a waste of money to fancily put a body in the ground, but no matter. He would benefit in the eyes of his subjects, many of whom were local Persians that he appointed in his stead, and for them, these rites and bellyaching were important. After the funeral, Haesteinn received reports of a great plague along the coast to his south, and as far as Baghdad. Looks like his instincts were right. It turns out that all of the Far East was being ravaged by a horrific plague now called the Black Death. This wasn't good. Haesteinn, as a trader and traveler, knew that plagues spread between people, so he closed up his capital and sat in his castle, waiting for the apocalypse to pass. Some in his realm believed that this plague was indeed the end of the world, and all sorts of religious leaders declared that the day of rapture, however that might look, was here, including his own priests, who called this plague Ragnarok. Haesteinn scoffed at this, saying that if the gods were fighting, they wouldn't do it with such disgusting tactics. Norse gods fight with honor. He knew the world wasn't ending. This was just a particularly bad disease from the east, and in a way, he was right, but this was not just some kind of bad disease, it was a truly destructive equalizer of all men. The Black Plague had spread throughout the entire known world in just a few years, and suddenly the grandeur of the urban centers across the world was reduced to nothing. There was a difference in population between the barren steppes and the metropolis of Rome, and death engulfed the world. Haesteinn watched from the windows of his castle as already half-dead men, women, and children clawed at the gate. The bodies piled up quickly, and every once in a while he'd send a man out to move them, and then leave him out there, knowing his fate was already sealed. For his immense selfishness, he became known as the Greedy, which was certainly true to him, but the way he looked at it, they were dying, and he was living. Who gets the last laugh? His subjects rose up against him in his isolation in March of 882, which was a strange choice. How could they rebel if they were dying to diseases in droves? Haesteinn could not just sit and let those ignorant fools rebel though, so he did raise his armies and send them out to die. Not to the enemy, but to the miasma surrounding his infection-free castle. It was after this rebellion that the plague did begin to recede. It was not necessarily that the disease was going away, but rather that there were no more people left to infect. Urban centers were destroyed, and even rural communities were devastated. By 884, the Black Plague was gone from Esfahan, which meant that Haesteinn could leave his castle. Of course, he immediately went to war with the last Dulifids of Qom, since in all this death, he just saw more opportunity. His armies were still strong, and he would use the wealth of the people around him to rebuild his capital city. Esfahan had the opportunity now to become the greatest city in the known world in a way. Perhaps this plague was the treasure of the East, In wiping out all the competition, Haesteinn could easily pick up the pebbles of what was left and create his perfect realm. Looking around the world a bit, we see that the only place spared by the plague was Bavaria and some other parts of Germany, as well as sub-Saharan Africa. Haesteinn, of course, had no care for the collapse of civilization as long as he could get richer, which he was. The plague eradicated the previously powerful armies of the Abbasids, and although his armies too were harmed, most of them had hunkered in the castle and avoided the plague. Looking west, Haesteinn heard a couple of quite interesting occurrences. First off, the Roman Empire was well and truly dead, but a new Roman Empire off in France and Germany had formed to take its place. In the plague, many found desperation and fear, but through their faith in God, they instituted a united empire that could keep them safe. In Italy, the peasant kingdom of Lombardy came to be. As the people there had no kings, they propped up their favorite peasant to rule. Disease sure does drive people crazy. Haesteinn conquered Khuzestan from a hamstrung Arabian empire, now having access to the seas, which for a Viking is a world of opportunity. He set sail for familiar lands to assess the damage of the plague. Rome, which was once the center of the world as far as many in the West were concerned, was now a lesser city than his own Esfahan. It was a strange picture, as Haesteinn jumped for joy at the destruction of the center of civilization, and then proceeded to sack whatever tiny huts had come up in an attempt to rebuild. Using the treasures he found in the dilapidated shacks of Rome, he was able to proclaim himself the king of Persia, and shortly after, he incorporated many Persian fashions and conventions into his court. He did so mostly because he saw the old world to his west as dead, and that now he must create a new culture that can spread throughout the world. These Persian people had their own history, and that was fine and all, but Haesteinn intended to use their words and history to create his own history. He couldn't be bothered to learn Persian though, so he kept everything in his native tongue and recorded it in the Arabic alphabet, which his scholars convinced him were better than carving everything into rocks. The new Persaland culture was a combination of the scholarship and architecture of the local region, with the great warriors and tactics of the Norse people. It had been now just over a decade since the plague hit, and the many ancient buildings of Esfahan had been repopulated, but people were looking for new idols to give them faith. It's not that their love of God had died, as basically all of Haesteinn's subjects were Muslims, but rather they needed a leader who they felt was one of them. Obviously, Haesteinn's faith was still with the old gods, who he felt would never abandon him, but he also believed that faith was something of a tool. If he embraced Islam, he'd be subject to the Caliph to the west, which was certainly not acceptable, but he also was deemed a total outsider with his current faith. He remembered all that time ago, those citizens that told him that the Friday Mosque of Esfahan was once a temple to fire worshippers. He asked some of his new Persian scholars about them, and he was informed of Zoroastrianism. This was exactly what he needed. A new faith, but one which he couldn't necessarily embrace right away. It would be seen as meaningless posturing if he just converted to Zoroastrianism without any meaningful event behind it. What was most interesting to Haesteinn's friends and family was how he had, for whatever reason, changed his focus away from just enriching himself into something grander. It turns out he had been getting his scholars to read him stories of the lands he sat in, and he heard of Alexander the Great, the Sassanids, the Parthians, all sorts of interesting stories. But what interested him the most was the first Persian Empire, the Achaemenid dynasty, which rose to become perhaps the first great empire of the known world. Haesteinn really liked these Achaemenids, sharing little bits and bobs of trivia that he learned, and even talked a bit about their old prophet Zoroaster. He wasn't normally an academic type, but a good story can enrapture anyone. His rulership continued successfully, with Esfahan and the surrounding area building back to the level they were at before the plague ever hit, which was not the same fate for much of the other areas nearby. Haesteinn saw many Turkic nomads pass through his land, which he allowed only because they were willing to fight the Caliph, who he saw as his enemy. What was more important though was that every Turkic nomad that fractured the empire would be an easy target to attack as they were recovering from their fights with the Caliph. This is what happened in Samarra, where Atabey Kaikustra had just established a new beylik. These horse archers were a scary enemy for the slow shield walls of Haesteinn's veterans, but he did incorporate some archers who could deal with these mounted nomads. As well, Norse shields were made of strong enough wood that they could hold back the relatively light arrows of a horse archer. The Atabey was captured in Dinawar, and so forced to surrender. He had just won Samarra, only to have it lost again to Haesteinn immediately. Samarra was an important city in Islam, and knowing that his subjects were almost entirely Muslim, Haesteinn left the city alone, but did tax it as any other subject. From there he conquered a little bit further into Mesopotamia, but left the historical cities of Baghdad and Babylon alone. They weren't really even cities at this point, thanks to the plague. There was a huge power vacuum throughout eastern Iran when several Turkic invaders shook the Safarid and Tahirid families. Previously, there was something of a balance between the two Persian families, the Bedouin border families like the Dulipids, and the Caliphate. But now there was a crumbling Arabian Empire, a rising foreign family, Haesteinn's, and several Turkic families vying for local control. Many of these Persian lords, now without a liege, were looking for safety from the encroaching Turks, but Haesteinn was no better choice for them. He'd have to at least present some kind of token of tolerance if he were to take them under his wing, and so he converted to Islam, but at the very least, a different branch than the Caliph. He converted to Mu'tazilism, which was popular in Khuzestan and Eastern Fars. With that conversion to Sunni Islam, the Sunni sections of Iran, which at this point were most of it, were willing to swear fealty, and the Shia parts were condemned to be subject to holy wars. Of course, for Haesteinn, this was all just politics. He still intended to make Zoroastrianism the new faith that would inspire his people and leave him his own master, but the benefits of Islam were made clear to him in the short term at least. He was able to use the eradication of aberrant schools of Islam as justification to invade as far north as Tabriz and as far east as Sindh. He even used the Turks, who were always looking for sponsors, to help him defeat certain enemies of his own faith. In Azerbaijan, a Sunni Arab, Haesteinn, ruled, but was unwilling to submit to Haesteinn, so he sponsored a Turk, Yaman of Sirdarya, to come and take his place. Afterwards, the new Bey of Azerbaijan did swear fealty to Haesteinn, which was exactly as he had planned. After all the Shias were eradicated, Haesteinn welcomed a new form of Islam, Azrakism. He was well liked by many of his subjects, who followed him into this extremist form of Islam, but which ultimately he only converted to for politics. He declared a war for all of Mesopotamia to reclaim the holy sites of Islam from the wayward Caliph in the name of his new Azraqi movement. By the time Haesteinn started to flip-flop his faith so much, he had earned enough secular respect that it didn't matter what faith he professed, his people would follow him. The Abbasid armies were far too busy dealing with their own internal struggles to defend Mesopotamia, so Haesteinn's forces occupied the whole region without resistance, but he wanted glory nonetheless. He set sail from Basra and found the Arab army in Mecca, which he then occupied and annexed. Taking Mecca, no matter his denomination of Islam, was highly legitimizing, and so Haesteinn, although not a caliph, became an important Muslim leader. He only refused to become caliph because he was well aware of his own plans to become Zoroastrian in due time. He took Hormuz from some Turkish invaders, inherited Azerbaijan by coincidence, and then conquered a few more regions of Persia controlled by foreigners. At one time, Haesteinn was one such foreigner, but after some 40 years of life here, he had become an integral part of the region, and his knowledge of the Achaemenids certainly helped his image. In July of 908, Haesteinn had consolidated enough of Iran and removed enough foreigners from it that he could declare a new Persian empire, a resurgence of Iranian heritage. He of course showed his true colors at this moment, as his conversion to Mazdaism Zoroastrianism was much more believable now that he had united Persia. The timing was impeccable, as Haesteinn really didn't have much longer left in his life. He was 93 years old and he sure did feel it. Nonetheless, he lived a life of luxury and fullness, having taken the advice of his friend Bjorn and found great riches in the east at Esfahan. He passed away in October of 908, just a few months after his empire was proclaimed, leaving the throne to his son, Ragnar. Ragnar, already a middle-aged man as he took the throne, had some big shoes to fill, but he also could ride out his father's immense accomplishments as a way to legitimize himself. Competence and nobility run in the blood, and Ragnar was Haesteinn's firstborn son. It may be difficult to assert his own greatness, but in the absence of his own accomplishments, he could build on his father's. Like his father, Ragnar studied the ancient Achaemenids looking for inspiration. He found an interest in Darius, whose legendary name was both the peak and the trough of the old empire. Darius II brought the empire to Egypt, Thrace, and even India, but Darius III was conquered by Alexander the Great, a shame which has always loomed over the Iranians. Ragnar decided he would try to emulate some of what Darius did, the second one, as he conquered and vassalized the remaining lands of Persia his father had not gotten. He justified his wars mostly as holy wars, given that he was going to return Zoroastrianism to its rightful place as the faith of all Iran. He restored the Magi to their places, creating a proper Zoroastrian religious hierarchy, and for this, he was celebrated across his empire. He could have chosen to start a legend about his revival of the priesthood, but he instead took the opportunity to embellish his own father's legacy, which still stood above him. Ragnar began the legend of his father's lineage from Darius the Great all the way down to Haesteinn. Whether such a connection could ever reasonably be proven or not was irrelevant. What mattered was that by his actions he had carried out the will of Darius' spirit, and Ragnar had done so as well. The legend would need some time to get around, and in that meantime, Ragnar will do what he can to rule Iran justly and to keep fighting the foreigners who occupy her soil. Because of his belief in Zoroastrianism, he was relatively well liked even in India, despite his faith being foreign, because the Buddhists and Hindus saw him as, in some way, connected to their dharmic fold. And so the empire expanded beyond even Persia under Ragnar, and it did so peacefully. By 924, Ragnar had vastly expanded the empire beyond even what Haesteinn had done, and his legend was gaining popularity in the heartlands around Esfahan, but his only roadblock thus far had been money. The Black Death and its consequences had proven disastrous for the Persian economy. Few caravans came anymore, and their goods were meager. Only Esfahan had begun to recover even this long after, and that was mostly thanks to the centralization of wealth that Haesteinn brought with his raids. The rest of Iran remained painfully poor. Ragnar's work was impressive, but he took the throne in his late 40s, so he only ruled for 16 years before dying and passing his throne on to his son, Olaf the Giant. He is probably the tallest emperor Persia had ever seen, and it was thanks to that size that his rule would be quite solid. Under Olaf, Haesteinn's descent from Darius would look more and more legitimate. Only legendary blood like that could produce a child so massive and healthy, although sometimes being so big could prove complicated for everyday life. It was a blessing and a curse, just like kingship itself. At first, disgruntled vassals of the empire rose up, looking for greater freedom within the empire, but Olaf had other plans for them. He needed money for his great civil projects in his domain, so he decided to fight back, hoping the ransoms from these lords might prove profitable compared to the cost of the war. One rebellion led to another, but Olaf wasn't scared. In many ways, he enjoyed war, and equally, he enjoyed handing out the punishments to those who rebelled. Being the judge and executioner was an honor for him, and to put down the insurrectionary Arabs and Indians who sought independence would let him replace them with Iranian lords instead. Unfortunately, these wars were indeed costly, as was this legend he was keeping around. He paid writers fortunes around the clock to keep the legend interesting and accurate, which was good, because he wanted the proof of his descendants from Darius the Great, but painful, because money was so hard to come by in this ravaged world. By October of 933, the legend had achieved mythical status, and it was in Olaf's hands what to do with it. He could hold on to it, let it keep spreading and enjoy its splendor, but he simply had no money for it. He decided that the legend would be ended, and that as its owner, he would be the one to reap its benefits. His claim to all of Iran was guaranteed now, and the stories of how Darius the Great was back to bring Persia to its greatest heights convinced many warriors to come to Olaf's side. The great general Andres al-Dawla came to the court with a host of reformed immortals ready to serve the new Persian Empire. He himself was of Norse lineage by his look, but was Persian in every other way. This was the beginning of the new Persian dynasty. The very identity of the Perso-Norse people had shifted in some way to reflect their new love and appreciation for Darius, whose progeny had brought them great benefit. Aspiring to be as great as Darius was no small task, and although stressful to those who would try to be like him, Darius' shadow pushed the Persolon people to work just that little bit harder. As the inheritor of the Achaemenid legacy, Olaf had rights to all of Iran, and used those rights to declare war on any who did not submit to his empire. His justification was the true unification of Persia, up to at least the heart of the Achaemenid borders. His military campaigns went far east and west, but in truth, most of Iran had already been conquered even before Olaf obtained this divine right. It did make the final conquest much easier. In particular, it was against the kingdom of Jazira that Olaf exercised his right to Persian hegemony with the most utility. Against the completely collapsed Arabian Empire, he also cited his right to Persian hegemony, and indeed the war he brought upon the Arabs was so immense that they dissolved, with the Caliph keeping control over Yemen and Armenia, while the rest of his realm went free. It was quite likely the Caliph would lose control over what remained of his realm in due time as well. With his conquest complete and all of Iran under his control, Olaf held a feast in the ways of the Norsemen to celebrate his victories. It was over. Iran was back, and it was on top. During his time studying the Achaemenid legends, though, he realized that there was still much work to be done. He had unified Persia, certainly earning him a place as Darius' descendant, but he still had so many figures to look to. Cyrus, Zoroaster, Amestris, and even the stories from Herodotus. Not every legend was based on a person, and he next set his eyes on the legendary immortals who he could use to conquer even further beyond his current land. Rather than do that though, Olaf chose to enjoy his realm for some time. He was a master administrator, and so far had managed to take the meager income of previous rulers and turn it into a healthy stream of cash, which would provide for him and his successors. What was the point of being Shahanshah if you could not enjoy the earthly pleasures of such a position? Olaf became known as the Worthy for all his work to elevate Persia, and for his connection to Darius, and indeed, the realm prospered under his watch, except for a plague that brought much central Persia to its knees, including Olaf himself. After having just been given the epithet of worthiness, he lost his life to a plague, indicating that perhaps he was not so worthy. He died at 53 years of age, overseeing the Haesteinn Persian Empire at its height. He left the throne to Hassan, his son, who was not nearly as popular as his father. Between the ongoing plague and the now somewhat failing economy due to Hassan's lacking skill compared to his father, Hassan was not very popular. He held a funeral for his father out in Tabriz, hoping to show reverence, but during the procession, many of his vassals rebelled against him. He overspent on the funeral, and without any taxes to sustain him due to the plague in his domain, he was vulnerable. The new Persian Empire erupted into chaos, and suddenly, the legendary line of Darius was already falling into question. This is where we stop the story for now, but not because the story is out of steam, but rather, I want you to experience the rest of the Achaemenid legends. In this mod that I've created, you got to see just one of the 5 unique legends available in the game. The other 4, which center around the Immortals, Amestris, Zoroaster, and Cyrus the Great, are all available to you without any spoilers, and I would be greatly happy if some of you chose to go and download my mod so you could try it out yourselves. I've never made a mod before, and this is my very first one, so I'm hoping it'll do at least somewhat okay. What I'd like from you, if you do check out the mod, is to let me know if you find any bugs or localization problems, and to let me know what you think and what you'd change. Obviously, since I'm not a highly experienced modder, I can't do everything, but I'll try my best. This mod will receive further updates in the future, which will add a little bit more variety, since right now, it's basically just the legends and all their unique effects. I'd like to add more random events and artifacts eventually, but I didn't want to delay this mod, so I put it out once its core mechanics were ready. I'd be truly honored if you even just looked at the Steam page, let alone downloaded and played the Achaemenid Legends mod. So thank you so much for watching, and thank you to the chatters who helped me with ideas for the mod. Your help is greatly appreciated. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for your time.